I have been called just about every name there is in this life. Comes with the job. You put yourself in front of millions of people. Some of them are going to love you and some of them are going to hate you. And after all these years, I've grown some pretty thick skin. I can take a shot. I really can. But that day, a woman looked straight into the camera on live television and she called my mother trash. My mother, who I had buried 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. The dirt on her grave was barely settled. And this woman, dripping in diamonds, sat on my stage and called her trash right to my face in front of the whole world. And I said nothing, not one word. The entire crowd was leaning forward in their seats, waiting for me to rise up out of my chair and tear that woman apart. Because Lord knows I've got the words to do it and everybody knows. And I just sat there, quiet, and I let the silence hang. And people thought I'd lost. You could feel it in the room. They thought she knocked the wind clean out of me. They thought that rich woman had finally found the one thing that could shut Steve Harvey's mouth. And maybe you're thinking the same thing right now. But here's what that crowd didn't know. Here's what she didn't know. Here's what not one single soul in that entire building knew except me. That woman had just insulted the one person on God's green earth who was the whole entire reason she was alive and breathing and sitting in that chair to say it. So stay with me. Because my silence that day did more damage than any words I've ever spoken in my life. That silence destroyed her. And by the time I'm done telling you why, you're going to understand that the quietest thing a man can do is sometimes the loudest thing in the world. And real quick before we go on, if you have ever in your life had to hold your tongue while somebody disrespected somebody you love, if you've ever had to swallow it down and keep your dignity when it would have been so much easier to lose it, then do me a favor and tap that subscribe button right now. Not for me. Do it for every person who ever kept their grace when the whole world expected them to break. Now let me take you back and tell you exactly what happened. To understand this story, you've got to understand where my head was that week. Because 3 weeks before this all happened, I stood in a little cemetery and watched them lower my mother into the ground. Now my mama, God rest her soul, she did not have anything in this world. Never did. Not one day of her life did that woman have 2 nickels to rub together. She cleaned houses, she scrubbed floors. For years and years, she worked the night shift mopping the halls of a county hospital, the kind of place folks go when they've got nowhere else. And she'd come home in the morning with her hands cracked and bleeding from the bleach, and she'd still make us breakfast before she let herself sleep. She raised us on almost nothing, bought our clothes from the church donation, stretched one chicken across a whole week of dinners. But I want to tell you something. That woman was the richest human being I've ever known in my life. And it isn't even close. Because she had something you cannot buy. And she had more of it than anybody I've ever met. She had dignity. And she had a heart so big, it's a wonder it fit inside her chest. She never once, not one time in her whole hard life, let being looked down on turn her bitter. People stepped over her, people talked down to her, people treated her like she was invisible, like she was part of the furniture, her whole life. And she answered every bit of it with kindness, every time. So when I lost her 3 weeks before this story, I lost the truest, kindest, most dignified person I ever knew. And I was still raw. I was still bleeding on the inside. And that is the state I was in when Eleanor Vance came sweeping onto my stage. Now let me tell you about Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Vance was old money, the kind of rich that goes back generations, or at least that's the story she told. She came onto the show that day for a segment we were doing about charity, because Eleanor ran a great big foundation. One of those foundations that throws fancy galas in ballrooms where the tickets cost more than my mama made in a month, all to raise money for the poor. And she swept into that studio like she owned it, chin up, looking down her nose at everything and everybody. And I'll tell you the first thing I noticed, because the knowing kicked in right away, that thing my grandmother always talked about. I watched how Eleanor treated my crew. And you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat the folks they think can't do anything for her. She didn't look at them, didn't thank them. When a young man on my team brought her a glass of water, she didn't even turn her head, just waved her hand at him like she was showing a flyer. Treated every hardworking person in that building like they were part of the floor. And I thought to myself, I met 100 Eleanors in my time. Folks who write $1 million check to the poor on Saturday night and then can't be bothered to learn their own housekeeper's name on Sunday morning. Charity as a costume, kindness as a photo opportunity. I had a feeling about that woman the second she walked in, but I kept it to myself and I smiled and I did my job because that's what professionals do. So we get into the segment. And at some point, the conversation turns to where we come from. And I did something I probably shouldn't have done, being as raw as I was. I started talking about my mother. I told that audience about my mama scrubbing those hospital floors on the night shift. I told them about her cracked and bleeding hands and how she never complained and how she taught me that there is no such thing as a job that's beneath your dignity, that the only thing beneath your dignity is treating another human being like they're beneath yours. I told them she was the finest person I ever knew and that I just lost her and that I'd give up everything I own, this whole career, all of it, for one more morning watching her make breakfast with those tired hands. And that crowd was with me. I could see people wiping their eyes. It was a real moment, a tender moment, a moment about a poor woman who lived and died with more grace than most kings. And Eleanor Vance could not stand it. I watched it happen on her face. She couldn't stand that the whole room was moved by a story that wasn't about her. She couldn't stand that a woman who scrubbed floors was getting the kind of love and respect that Eleanor had spent her whole life buying and never quite managing to earn. And so she decided right then to put me back in my place, to remind everybody in that room where the real value was. She gave this cold little laugh, and she said, "Oh, Steve, that's very touching. It really is. But let's be honest with each other, shall we? A woman who scrubs floors for a living isn't a hero. She's just, well," and she waved her diamond-covered hand in the air, searching for the word, and then she found it, and she smiled when she said it. People like that are the trash the rest of us have to step over on our way up in this. It's just the natural order of things. No offense to your mother, of course. Trash. She called my mother trash. 3 weeks in the ground, on live television. And then she smiled at me, waiting to see me break. The gas that went through that studio. I've heard a lot of gas on that stage in my life, but this one had teeth in it. This one was pure shock. The whole room froze solid, and every single face in that building turned toward me, waiting for the explosion, waiting for Steve Harvey to stand up and rain down fire on this woman the way she so richly deserved. And I want you to understand, that's exactly what I wanted to do. Every cell in my body wanted to do it. The grief and the rage came up in me like a flood, so hot and so fast I could barely see straight. My mama. My sweet mama with the bleeding hands who gave away her last dollar to strangers her whole life. Called trash by a woman wearing more money on one finger than my mother earned in a decade. But here is the thing. Here is the exact thing that stopped me. In that split second, right when the rage hit its peak, something else clicked in the very back of my mind. Because a few minutes before all this, while Eleanor was going on about herself, the way she loved to do, she had said something, a little detail. And it had snagged on something deep in my memory, some story I'd heard 100 times, and I couldn't quite place it yet. But that snag was there. And some instinct in me, the knowing, my mama's own knowing that she passed right down to me, whispered one word, wait. So I did the single hardest thing I have ever done on that stage in all my years. Harder than any monologue, any tough interview, any live disaster. I looked at the woman who had just called my dead mother trash, and I said nothing. I closed my mouth. I folded my hands, and I let her keep talking, because everybody in that room thought I was frozen. Everybody thought she finally shut me up. But the truth is, I had gone quiet on purpose. I wanted her to keep going. That little snag in my memory was pulling at me, and I just knew that if I stayed silent, that woman's pride would do the rest. A proud person cannot stand the silence. They have to feel it. And when they feel it, they always show you exactly who they are. So I gave her the silence, and she walked right into it. Because when I didn't fight back, when I just sat there quiet, Eleanor took it as a victory. Of course she did. She thought she'd won. She thought she finally found a poor boy underneath the famous man and put him in his place. And winning for a woman like that is like blood in the water. It made her bold. It made her hungry. And she leaned back in her chair, and she got comfortable, and she started in on her very favorite subject in all the world, herself. She started telling the whole room about how she made it, about her greatness. You see, Steve, she said, waving that hand around, the difference between me and a woman who scrubs floors is that I refuse to stay down. I came from nothing, nothing at all. And I clawed my way up to everything I have, all by myself with these 2 hands. And I never once took a handout from a single living soul. That's why I don't believe in coddling the poor. Nobody coddled me. And she was rolling now. just puffing herself up bigger and bigger in front of the whole world, painting herself as this magnificent self-made queen who rose up from the gutter through sheer force of will. And the crowd was watching a rich woman brag, and they were disgusted, and I understood why. But I wasn't hearing what they were hearing, because then she told the story, her origin story, the one she clearly polished up and told 1,000 times at 1,000 fancy dinner tables. And as she told it, my blood ran cold, and then it ran hot, and then I nearly came up out of my chair for an entirely different reason than the one everybody was expecting. She said, why, 30-some years ago, I was at the lowest point a person can be at, flat broke, alone. I was in a bed at that awful old county hospital downtown. You know the one, the place where they send people who have nothing. And do you know, not one single person in that whole place lifted a finger to help me. Not one. I nearly died in there, alone and penniless. And I survived it entirely on my own. And I climbed out of that pit by myself. And I've never looked back. That, Steve, is why I am who I am today. The county hospital, downtown. 30-some years ago. The lowest night of her life. And the snag in my memory came loose all at once. And the whole thing came flooding into me. And I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep myself steady. Because I knew that hospital. I knew it better than I knew my own name. That was the hospital where my mother mopped the floors on the night shift for 11 years. And 30-some years ago, my mama used to tell me a story. She told it to me over and over, my whole childhood. And she never once told it to brag, because bragging was not in that woman anywhere. She told it because it was one of the proudest moments of her whole life. She used to tell me about a night, working late, when she found a young woman in one of those beds, all alone. No family, no friends, not a dollar to her name, terrified out of her mind and about to be turned out because she couldn't pay for the care she needed to make it through the night. And everybody else, all the folks who got paid a whole lot more than my mama did to actually care for people, they'd all clocked out and gone home and left that girl to her fate. But my mother didn't clock out. My mother stopped. I sat there on my own stage 30 years later, and I looked at Eleanor Vance bragging about how she survived that night all by herself with nobody's help. And I understood something that took the air right out of my lungs. The young woman in that bed was her. The woman she was talking about, the pitiful, penniless girl that nobody helped, that she claimed she saved all by her own bootstraps. That was Eleanor. And the person who actually saved her, the person she had erased completely from her own story so she could call herself self-made, was my mother. The woman she had just 2 minutes ago called trash. My mama never knew what became of that girl. She never knew she grew up rich. She used to wonder about her out loud some. She used to say, I hope that young lady made it, wherever she is. I hope she did something good with the years the good Lord gave her. She never forgot. She remembered the date every single year. And that girl grew up into a woman who came onto my stage and spit on my mother's grave and called it self-made. Now I want to tell you what I did next, because it is the whole entire point of this story, and I need you to really hear me. I did not scream at her. I did not stand up and unleash 30 years of my mother's stolen credit on that woman's head, even though I had every right to, even though the words were right there loaded and ready. Because I realized sitting there that screaming was exactly what a woman like Eleanor knew how to survive. Cruelty she could handle. Cruelty she'd been dishing out and taking her whole life. If I came at her with fire, she'd have something to push back against, something to make herself the victim of, and she'd have walked out of that studio with her story still intact. No, I knew, deep in my bones, that there was only one thing on this earth that could truly reach a woman that proud. And it wasn't rage, it was grace. The exact thing my mother would have done, so I let her finish. I let her get all the way to the end of her little speech about being self-made, and the room went quiet, waiting on me. And I leaned forward, and I kept my voice as soft and as gentle as I could make it. And I asked her one quiet question. I said, ma'am, that hospital, was it the old county one down on the east side? And can I ask you something? That night you nearly died all alone with nobody to help you. I paused. Was there a cleaning lady working the night shift? A black woman, older, with a mop and a bucket, who maybe stopped by your bed when everybody else had gone home. And I watched the smile freeze on Eleanor Vance's face. She didn't answer, but I saw it move behind her eyes. A flicker, a memory she buried 30 years deep, clawing its way back up to the surface. She didn't know why I was asking. She didn't understand yet, but something in her had started, very faintly, to remember. And then I said, the quietest, gentlest, most devastating thing I've ever said to another human being in my life. I didn't say it cruel. I said it kind. I said it the way my mother would have wanted me to say it. I said because that cleaning lady was my mother, the one you just called trash. And she told me about you every single year on the anniversary of that night for 30 years. She never knew your name, but she never forgot you. She used to pray that you'd made it. She used to hope wherever you ended up that you were happy and safe and doing well. And I let that sit for just a moment. She'd be so glad to know you did so well for yourself, ma'am. She really would. And that was it. That was the whole thing. That was the silence and the truth inside it. And it landed on that woman like the roof coming down. Because you cannot fight that. There is no defense against it. If I had screamed at her, she could have screamed back. If I had insulted her, she could have called security, played the victim, stormed off in a huff of righteous indignation. But what do you do? What can you possibly do when the son of the woman you just called trash looks you dead in the eye and tells you, gently, kindly, that his dead mother spent 30 years praying for your happiness? There's nothing you can do except finally see yourself. And I watched Eleanor Vance see herself for the first time in 30 years. I watched the color drain right out of her face, from her forehead all the way down. I watched the whole magnificent structure she'd built her entire life on, the self-made queen who owed nobody anything. I watched it collapse behind her eyes in real time, because it had all, every bit of it, been built on erasing one poor woman, on forgetting the cleaning lady, on stepping over the very person who lifted her up, and telling herself and everyone else that she'd risen up all alone. And now that cleaning lady had a name, and a face, and a son. And that son was being kind to her about it. And the kindness was the thing she could not survive. The room understood now, all of them. You could feel the realization roll across that audience like a wave, and when it hit, they did not boo. They didn't scream at her. They just went silent, cold and silent, and they turned away from her. Hundreds of people, the same way you turn away from something you can't stand to look at. And Eleanor Vance sat there all alone in the middle of it, in all her diamonds, with the truth of her whole life exposed in front of the entire world. Now, I want to be very clear with you about something, because this is the part that matters most. I did not destroy that woman. I never raised my voice one time. I never called her a single name. All I did was hold up a mirror and let her look into it. And for the first time in 30 years, she saw what she'd been refusing to see. That's all. Because here is what I have learned, and I want you to carry it with you. The most powerful thing you can ever do to a proud person is not to fight them. It's to show them grace at the exact moment they've earned the opposite, cruelty. A proud soul can fight all day long. But grace? Grace from the very person you have wronged? That will bring a human being to their knees every single time. That is the one weapon they have no armor against. And of course, the world was watching. Somebody had their whole thing on camera, and it was online within an hour. But here's what was so perfect and so terrible about how it spread. The clip that went viral, the one that got shared millions and millions of times, it wasn't me. It was her. It was Eleanor Vance in her own voice, leaning back in that chair, bragging to the whole world about how she came from nothing and rose up all alone and never took a handout from a single living soul. Her own words, her own mouth, played over and over right next to the truth of who actually saved her life that night. She hadn't needed me to destroy her at all. She'd done the whole thing herself, with her own bragging, and I'd just been the one to quietly pull the curtain back. The woman who built a foundation preaching self-reliance to the poor, exposed to all the world as someone who owed her very life to the kind of poor person she'd spent a lifetime despising. But I don't want to leave you sitting in her wreckage, because honestly, she's not what this story is about. This story is about my mother. So let me tell you the last piece. Let me tell you what my mama actually did that night. The thing Eleanor spent 30 years pretending never happened. Because when I found out as a boy, it changed the way I understood what a human being is capable of. My mother, that night, was making almost nothing, barely enough to keep our lights on. And she kept her emergency money, the rent money, everything she had in this world, folded up small and tucked inside her shoe because she didn't trust leaving it at home and she didn't have a bank account. And when she found that terrified young woman in that hospital bed, about to be turned out into the night because she couldn't cover what she owed, my mother reached down into her own shoe and she took out every dollar she had to her name, the rent, the grocery money, all of it, and she pressed it into that girl's hands. And then, because she'd given away her bus fare too, my mother walked home, miles and miles, in the cold, in the dark, after a full night of mopping floors on her tired feet so that a stranger she would never see again could live. She never told a soul except me. She never asked for a thank you. She never tried to find that girl again to collect on the debt. She counted herself lucky, blessed even, that God had put her in the right place at the right time to help somebody who needed it. That was my mother. That was the woman Eleanor Vance called trash. A woman who gave away everything she owned to a stranger and walked miles home in the cold and considered herself the fortunate one for having gotten to do it. So here's how it ended. Eleanor tried to apologize. She stammered something out there at the end, but we both knew, everybody knew, that an apology wasn't the point and couldn't be. You cannot apologize your way out of 30 years of a life built on a lie. Something sorry doesn't reach. I didn't yell at her. I didn't need to. I just let the truth stand there in the room, and the truth was heavier than anything I could have said. And then I did the only thing that felt right. I announced right there, live, that in my mother's memory, I was starting something. A fund. Not another fancy foundation with galas and ballrooms, but a simple, real thing to help the night shift workers, the cleaners, the invisible people who mop the floors and empty the bins and do quiet, extraordinary, heroic things for strangers in the middle of the night and never, ever get thankful. And I put my mother's name on it so that the trash woman's name would live on and do good long after everybody had forgotten the rich woman who insulted her. And I'll give you one last thing, because life had one more turn in it that I didn't expect. Some months later, an envelope showed up, no name on it, and inside was word that every single cleaner and night shift worker at that old county hospital, the ones who were still there and the ones long retired, had quietly had their debts paid off. All of them, anonymously. Every mortgage, every medical bill, every loan, just gone. And there was one unsigned note that came with it, 4 words. It said, from someone who finally remembered. Now, I can't prove who sent it, but I have my idea. And I choose to believe that the silence I gave that woman did something that 1,000 angry words never could have. I choose to believe that grace reached a place in her that cruelty never would have found, because that is what my mother believed about people, right up until her last breath. That everybody, even the hardest, proudest soul, has a door in them somewhere, and kindness is the only key that fits it. So when folks ask me, Steve, why didn't you defend your mama that day? Why did you just sit there and say nothing while that woman insulted her? Here is what I tell them. My mother spent her whole life being invisible to people like Eleanor Vance. She got looked down on and stepped over and treated like she was part of the floor every day of her life. And she never once let it turn her hard. She answered a lifetime of contempt with nothing but kindness, every single time. So the day somebody called her trash on live television, I figured the very best way I could honor that woman was not to become loud and cruel and hard. It was to be exactly what she was, quiet and graceful, and to trust the truth, to do what the truth always does, if you just give it enough silence to finally be heard. My mama never had a dime to her name, but she was the richest woman I have ever known. And that rich lady and all her diamonds, she found out that day that she'd been the poor one all along. So let me leave you with this tonight, and then I'll let you. There are people all around you every single day that the world has decided don't matter. The ones who clean up after us, the ones who serve us and are never seen, the ones somebody somewhere has called trash. And I promise you, some of those quiet, invisible souls are carrying more dignity and more goodness in their tired hands than the richest person you'll ever meet carries in their whole life. So look at them, see them, thank them, because you never ever know which one of them might be somebody's whole entire reason for being alive. If this story moved you tonight, do 3 things for me before you go. Subscribe to this channel, because we tell the stories that remind us what a person is really worth. Share this with one person you love, because somebody out there needs to be reminded that their quiet goodness matters. And go down to those comments and type the words "her name mattered" for my mother and for every invisible soul out there who ever gave everything they had and never once got thankful. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one. God bless you, and God bless every quiet, invisible, extraordinary soul out there scrubbing the floors of this world and holding it up with their own 2 hands.